I'm Chu, and welcome to week 3. Is it week 3? Time
I think it's week
passes.
4.
Week
Yeah.
4. Welcome
Three
to
and a
week
half.
4.
Week 4 and
Three and a
a half.
half. Today we'll be talking about character design. So this conversation is more on the artsy side of things. I am kind of the art person here, one of the art persons here. I don't do much coding, but I know a lot about art and character design. So that's what I'm going to teach you about today. What is character design? Well, as it says here, it's the process of creating characters, ideally in a way where their personality can be recognized through visuals alone. Uh, there is also a part of character design which is like more writing focus, more on like personality and like history and that sort of stuff, but that's not what we're talking about. This is solely a visual talk. And also, before I get going, if you guys have any questions along the way, feel free to like speak up or put something in like the no mic channel and I will be looking. So I am down to stop and just explain stuff on the way if there's something that is confusing to you. But first off, I am going to open up with a question to you all. So feel free to just like shout these out or put them in the chat. What do you think a good character design should have, or what do you think is part of a good character design? Are there any ideas out there?
A good silhouette.
Yeah, good silhouette. That is one of them.
Distinct from the rest of the game
Distinct.
or whatever medium it is.
Yeah. Good character designs tend to be distinct. Okay, we'll move on, but ooh, that was weird, but here are some things I think make a good character design. So, someone said distinct, which is one of these things on here. A lot of good character designs are like very memorable, very distinct. Like maybe Mario, a very distinct character. Everyone knows him. Everyone knows like the red hat and the red M on it. Things that are memorable are good character designs. It shows what a character is like without telling. So you can show someone your character and they'll immediately know, oh, this is like the villain, or oh, this is the protagonist, or whatever. It looks good. It's fun to work with for your artists and for the people animating it. If it's not enjoyable to work with, then that's not great. And the thing I didn't read yet is the first point, which I think is the most important point, is that it achieves its purpose. And we'll talk more about that and like the intent in character designs, because I think that's what should be most kept in mind, more so than just like looking cool or whatever. And the last point does not detract from gameplay. So this applies specifically to game development, but sometimes some character designs are just not good in the context of like developing games or making games. And we'll talk more on that too. So contrastly, what do you guys think bad character designs are like?
Unmemorable.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Bland. Single
bland.
note.
I see some typing. Oh, why does this? Everything is. Sometimes things are glitching out. Here we go. All right, so we'll talk about the bad. So on the previous slide, I said character designs that achieve their purpose are good. So obviously the opposite is like bad. And people said bland. It lacks in clear personality, painful on the eyes, or uncanny. As you can see, Sonic on the side there, the first rendition of him, nobody liked that rendition of him because it kind of took away from what his character design like originally is, and then they fixed it and it's now better. And also here, too difficult to reasonably work with. As I said, in the context of like video games, you want a design that will actually not be too much of a pain to animate. And stuff that detracts from gameplay is also bad, which again I will talk about more. But we'll move on to some key ideas that you should keep in mind when designing your characters. And I think the most important one is this, which is purpose and intent. And it's important to ask yourself these questions. And the guiding question is, what do I want this design to achieve? On the right side, it's like a little excerpt from one of the designers in Dark Souls, and it's talking about how they go about designing their monsters in Dark Souls. And the thing is, with their monsters in Dark Souls, they're not just trying to like make something that's gross and scary. As it says here, Miyazaki said, "Don't rely on the gross factor to portray an undead dragon. Can't you instead try to convey the deep sorrow of a magnificent beast doomed to a slow and possibly endless descent into ruin?" So it's really important to think about, what do I want my players to feel when they see this character, or what sort of feelings do I want to invoke when people see this design? What should their impression be? What are the reasonings behind this? Like, this is the most important thing. Like, hey, how is the player supposed to feel, and how can I achieve those things using all these other factors that I will talk about? So as you can see here, I think this is concept art of that undead dragon. Very cool. With all like the rotting flesh, and it's just like covered in like mold and decay, and probably not a good life for it. Conversely, um, we talked about in the previous slides how if a design is bland, then it's potentially bad, but also if the intent is for the design to be like bland because you are planning to do something with it later, that's what you would call a subversion. Some of these characters on screen are characters you might be familiar with, and their designs are meant to be cutesy and friendly, but if you have played either of these games where these characters came from, which is Undertale and Doki Doki Literature Club, you may know that the tones of those games are the opposite of what these cute pictures might show you. And here's some more like subversions of video games. The Mimic, which is like in many, many video games, is a subversion of expectations, because when you see a treasure chest, your first instinct is, oh, this is something that I can open and get like loot from. But then a mimic subverts that expectation by actually being an enemy and punishing you for opening the treasure chest. And the same with this little enemy from Kirby. He seems very cute, but the moment you look away from him, he turns into the little guy on the right and tries to attack you. Small things like that. So one of the most important things to think about too is like the context of your world that your video game is in. So this goes a little bit into world building, which I won't talk about, but generally it's like, oh, if this game is taking place in a fantasy setting, what sort of clothing would be normal here? It's obviously you don't want to put like some wizardy type character into a cyberpunk or realistic world. So it's thinking about what sort of boundaries you're going to be setting up with your world, and like what is the norm here? How should like the cohesive world feel like? What sort of world do these characters live in? And personality. What is your character like? How is their personality shown in their appearances? Like you see Shantae here, which is a character on the left. She is a genie. She is in a. The context of her world is more like it's more fun. It's more childish. So her design is more uh, it's more bright and colorful as opposed to Altair from Assassin's Creed, which is obviously a game about assassins and taking place in a more like realistic slash historical context. So obviously he needs to dress that way and keep his identity hidden. Like ask yourself like, hey, what does this character like? How do they dress themselves? Do they dress themselves like this? Does someone else dress them like this? How do they want to present themselves, and how should the player feel when they see this character? And also, shapes and gestures are important. This is a little bit more on the theory side of things, and there aren't like too many examples of this. But as it says here, different shapes in line language hold like different sorts of connotations. So, round edges are more friendly. Jagged and pointy things are more dangerous, and squares are considered stables. Hearts are associated with love. Maybe clovers are associated with luck. There are a lot of like existing meanings to shapes that you can use to your advantage in your character designs. Like this character on the right, there are a bunch of hearts all over her design, which speaks a bit to her character, and you can already assume a little bit about what she's like just from seeing all those things. And here we have some more examples, like Kirby. he is very round. There are no pointy lines on Kirby because his games and the tone of his games and himself is that he is a very friendly character. So, like it says here, he just consists of only round edges. Meanwhile, the character on the right is very spiky, very edgy looking. There's a lot of pointy bits on him, so he comes off as more dangerous and unfriendly as opposed to Kirby over there, who is just vibing and trying to say hello. We talked a little bit about silhouettes. I'll expand on this a little bit more, but you want to consider, hey, is my character distinct from their silhouette alone? Like, if you black out everything entirely, can I still tell like who it is, or can I at least still tell that these characters are different? These silhouettes are all from TF2, which does a really good job of like differentiating their characters, which is very important in a first-person shooter game where you want to be able to like tell very easily who the people on the enemy team are. So when the silhouettes are very distinct like this, and when things are very cohesive, it makes it much easier to play the game and like aim at people. And consider props too when you're making character silhouettes. Like even if their physique alone isn't enough to make a good silhouette, the things that they're carrying may be enough to like actually add more to their character. And moving on from that, body language and expression are pretty important, especially in video games, because as it says here, a lot of characters in video games need to have like an idle pose generally. Like when your character is standing still, they're not just standing completely still, at least in most games, because you kind of just want the character to still feel alive even when the player is not like putting in any inputs. So the way a character moves or idles is also part of their design, not just like what they look like. So you see Terry on the left, he looks more stanced up and ready to brawl and like facing forward as like characters tend to do in like traditional fighters. And Marth over there, he's looking a little more refined, a little bit sassy. He's supposed to be more of a princely character, so he tends to like pose himself more as such. And here's some whoa, there's something happening in the background. And here's some like fighting game sprites that all have like different personalities. Like the guy on the left, he seems a little bit skeevy. The guy in the middle, a little bit confident. And the guy on the right, he looks like he's looking forward and ready to fight. He's leaning forward, looks like he's about to like go into action. So these are things you should consider when you're making your characters or like making their assets in games. Is like, how should they stand? Because the way they just stand says a lot about a character. And there's also color. Different colors have different meanings and associations tied with them, um, which are things that I can't all go over at once here. So this is something you should research on your own. But I think one of the most important things is that primary colors, or just bright colors in general, are considered to be like more friendly and more whimsical. So if you want to create a game that's more out there and like non-realistic, you might want to use like really bright, vibrant colors, like maybe Going Under. Going Under, which is a game that was produced by some alumni of this club, has very bright colors. It's a very like silly game about like beating up people in in offices and all that kind of jazz. Meanwhile, like grays, browns, things that are considered like more natural feel more bleak. So when you're playing like The Last of Us or something where it's a zombie apocalypse, you don't usually see any bright neon colors in the world or in the characters themselves. And as it says there, or pick something that stands out. Sometimes in a more like simpler game, you just want to like pick a character color that stands out against the background so your player can have an easy time seeing the character. Because again, in the context of video games, it's important to have that sort of distinction between who the player character is and who everyone else is. Here are some more examples of color. On the right is like Dark Souls, where all the characters are like very gray and muted because the tone of Dark Souls is very dark and mucky and serious. Meanwhile, on the left, we have Pikachu and Mario, who use primary colors red, blue, and yellow, which give them more of a like a kid-friendly vibe because they're all bright and they're bright on the eyes. And moving on a little bit from that, uh, there's the idea of simplicity versus complexity, and this kind of goes more into like hey, is this feasible to work with? So on the right, you have like Genji from Overwatch, and you have the main character of Celeste, which I don't know the name of. I don't know if her name is Celeste. I don't think it is.
I think
It's
so.
Madeline.
Yeah, Madeline. Yeah, so as you can see, like Madeline's design is a lot more simpler, especially because you can see there's like an actual screenshot of the game. She has to be like simplified down to pixels, but it's still like recognizable. You can see that the red hair like is like a key trait of hers that can be translated down into like tinier pixels. You might have a harder time doing that with Genji because there's a lot of detail on his designs. And when you think about this, especially since we're like smaller devs, we're not like a big dev team. When you're designing a character, you don't want to make something that's like too complicated to draw or animate, because when you do not have multiple artists or multiple animators, it's very hard to try to make someone that has like 50 belts on their character designs and then produce like high quality animations of every single thing they do. And it's also important to like ask, does the complexity detract from the gameplay experience? Someone talked to me once about how in Overwatch they don't really allow skins in competitive settings because some of the skins are very complicated and they kind of make it difficult for players on the opposite team to like tell who the enemy is because of the complexity in those skins, which is why usually it's like, oh, teams have like their team color to work with. So consider that like, hey, is this design being too complicated, make it too hard to actually see this character or comprehend what the character is doing? Because when you're designing for a video game, it's like, what is the player's experience and how do I make this easy for them? So right here we have some. So speaking of 50 belts, the girl on the left has like a dress made out of belts, which I can only imagine would be a nightmare for animators to work with, and is extremely complicated and maybe unnecessarily complicated, and probably very hard to translate over into 3D and even harder to make 2D animations of. Meanwhile, we have 2B on the right, who there are some complexities to her design, but for the most part, it's like very simple and clean, sort of just all black, not too much like fancy details to them. And even if you like tried to simplify her, it would still probably convey like the same character. And it's easy to work with if you try to like maybe animate in 2D because you don't have to like add the detail of 50 belts and can instead just like have like one pitch black shape. So generally, like the easier a design is to simplify, the the easier it is to like work with it within the context of a video game because animations and assets won't be too hard to create for them. And continuing off of that, as I said, in the end, you want your character designs and their actions to be clear to your player because you just want your player to know what is going on at the screen, and it's a much better experience for the player if they can tell where they are at all times, if they can tell who they are at all times. Like the problem with making your protagonist a Mr. Generic Peasant Man number 3 is that if they get in a crowd of generic peasant men, then suddenly they do not know where their character is. So it is important to like consider clarity and contrast with like other players and the things around them. Like in general with video games, you want your designs to like look like they're interactable. So you want your player to stand out, you want your items on the screen to stand out, you want your enemies on the screen to stand out. There just needs to be some sort of contrast between everything around them that they're not supposed to be interacting with. Because it's like, oh, if they need to interact with maybe a tree, if all the trees look the same, then how are they supposed to know which tree they need to interact with? Versus like, oh, there are a lot of trees, but this specific tree has like rainbow leaves, so the player knows that, oh, this is something interesting that I should pay attention to. And the same applies to like NPC designs. Like maybe your NPCs all have like generic old man villager NPCs, but then like there are jokes about this, but then oh, suddenly the NPC that might join your party has like anime blue hair in the middle of a village where everyone is like really generic. But that's the point. There needs to be contrast so players can know like what's important in your game and what they should be paying attention to. Otherwise, they're going to miss it. So going off of those principles, like, okay, that's a lot. Where are you supposed to start when it comes to designing your character visually? And mostly it's just research and taking like inspiration from other things. It's really hard to come up with stuff on your own, and in the end, like, chances are something you come up with is something that someone else has already done, and there's not really any issue with that. I think certain ideas are like prevalent or happen a lot because people like them. Like elves are not an original thing. People have like created so many elf characters, but that doesn't make them any less cool, or that doesn't mean that they can't be any less cool. So like look into different cultures, look into different fashions, look into real life creatures and things. Like maybe you want to make a character that's based off a cat, or maybe the character is a cat, or maybe you want to do something more abstract, like base characters off of like zodiacs or something. Maybe you want to base things off of mythology, like the picture on the right is from Hades, which is based off of like Greek mythology. Or maybe you really like Legend of Zelda or something, and you think that some of the design elements there are cool. Like, feel free to take inspiration from that too. Just don't copy things one for one, because at that point, that's not inspiration. That's just plagiarism. But generally, just like observe the world around you and just like work with what you already have, because coming up with something just from thin air is really hard, but there are a lot of good things to take inspiration from, and people will commend you for like integrating like different cultures and fashions and concepts into your characters. And I think a lot of design is just a lot of reiteration. Like on the right, it shows some like Monster Hunter concept art. You just need to go through a lot of different versions of something to make sure it reaches its fullest potential. Because maybe sometimes you'll like draw a character and then think, "Oh yeah, this is great," and then later on you realize, "Oh, but if I added this to their design later on, this would make it even better because this fits the character even better." So take time with your character designs. Sometimes you discover later down the line as you learn more about the character you're creating that something might fit them better. And that is why concept art exists to begin with, is that ideas change and grow into their final versions of themselves. And here's just more concept art. For example, the top is like Stardew Valley, and then there's some Fire Emblem stuff. But as you can see, like he made, or the creator of Stardew Valley made many different sprites before it landed on the final one, and the first one is very different from what the last one ended up being. So there is no shame in just taking your time and redoing a design over and over until it fits what you need or fits what the game needs. And I think that's it. So if you guys have any last questions or want to know anything specifically, this is the time to ask it. Otherwise, thank you for coming.
When you make a character, how do you like start it? Does it just like hit you in the head and you're like, oh, gotta make that a character? Or do you like think for a specific thing you want to hit?
I think for me, generally, I'm someone that really enjoys colors in art, so more often than not, where I start from is like, hey, what color do I want to make this character? And then and then it develops from there, because I'm just like, oh, I want a character that is blue, so I'm just gonna make a character that is blue, and we'll see what happens. And then maybe I'll be like, oh, all right, what's their personality like? Do I want to give them any like motifs? For example, I have a character that's like, oh, I want to make a character that is blue and purple, and maybe I'll shove some star and space motifs because I think that is cool. So we'll do that. What kind of weapon might they have? I don't know, stars and space. Maybe a scythe, because a scythe is shaped like a crescent, so I can put in some moon motifs. It's just a lot of like ideation, being like, hey, what do I want to do? Sometimes it is just a matter of like, what is cool, or what do I think is cool? At least for personal things, like what you think is cool is like, yeah, it's fine, it's whatever. But if you're trying to deliver a message, then usually you want to think beyond like, what looks cool to me? Anything else?
Oh, When it comes to like creating assets for games, how do you go about keeping size, like heights and sizes, consistent between your characters?
If you're making assets for games, at least if you're making it in like an art program, just make sure you have like all your sprites on like the same thing or like the same sized canvas or that sort of thing. At least in like 3D animation and stuff, what we would usually do is like put all our like assets onto like one file so we could have like this little size chart of everything next to each other to make sure that they were at like a reasonable size with each other, because obviously you don't want to like make your character and then like make a chair sprite but then the chair sprite is like 5 times larger than the character. So it's always good to like work with one of your previous assets like next to your new asset or just like somewhere where you can like directly compare it so it doesn't become too large or too small
Okay.
and not match sizes, yeah. Well, I will stick around for a bit if there's anything else, but I will start closing this thing because we don't really need that. These slides should be. I will put them into the folder where all our presentations are, so if anyone wants to access it later, it'll be there.
Clap.
Well, thank you too.
Yeah.
If everyone
Thank
could
you
say
for
like
coming.
thank you or clap, unmute and clap, I think that'd be hilarious.
Unmute and clap, you must. If you don't, you're in trouble.